Hello and welcome to another episode of Levy's Customs. I'm Nathan and today we're going to be taking a look at the Asus TUF Gaming FX504GM, a mid-range gaming laptop from 2008. This laptop is armed with an Intel Core i7-8750H, a 6-core 12-thread CPU, an NVIDIA 1066GB GPU, 16GB of RAM, a 256GB M.2 SATA SSD, and a 1TB hard drive. As for the screen, it has a matte 15.6-inch 120Hz 1080p IPS panel. The body is plastic, but the lid is a brushed metal. On the right side of the laptop, there is a 3.5mm headphone jack with DTS headphone X, two USB 3.0 ports, a USB 2.0 port, HDMI port, Ethernet port, and power port. On the left, just a Kensington lock, nothing else. 11 Phillips screws hold the bottom panel in place, and as you can see, you're able to upgrade the RAM, wireless chip, and storage. The fans are a special design that is supposed to reduce the amount of dust built up, which is pretty interesting. This laptop also comes with a 150-watt power brick. Alright, let's jump into some benchmarks now. Just to let you know, all benchmarks are done at 1080p and at 100% resolution scaling. Fortnite on the high preset and DirectX 11 got an average of 58 frames per second and a 1% low of 22 frames per second. For the most part, the game ran well, but would stutter at some pretty inopportune times. Metro Exodus on the medium preset and tessellation enabled, we got an average of 80 frames per second and a 1% low of 50 frames per second. This game ran smoothly and better than I expected. Overwatch on the high preset got an average of 137 frames per second and a 1% low of 55 frames per second. Even at high settings, this game is utilizing that 120Hz refresh rate. CSGO on the highest settings got an average of 150 frames per second and a 1% low of 34 frames per second. This game is definitely able to make use of that high refresh rate, but would be more stable at a lower graphical setting. Cyberpunk 2077 on the low preset with medium textures got an average of 51 frames per second and a 1% low of 23 frames per second. The game mostly stayed in the 30s and 40s with irregular stuttering, but would sometimes hit over 60 frames per second, but that was pretty rare. Forza Horizon 5 on the medium preset got an average of 79 frames per second and a 1% low of 54 frames per second. The frame rate seemed to fluctuate a lot, mostly ranging from the 60s to 80s, but it would occasionally dip into the 50s and peak into the 90s. Warzone on the medium settings got an average of 69, nice, frames per second and a 1% low of 42 frames per second. Warzone stayed in the 60s most of the time and felt comfortable playing like that. Doom Eternal on the medium preset got an average of 86 frames per second and a 1% low of 45 frames per second. While mostly staying in the 80s, the game would drop into the 40s or hit over 100 frames per second at certain times. Grand Theft Auto 5 with high settings got an average of 70 frames per second and a 1% low of 34 frames per second. GTA ran well, normally staying over 60 frames per second. Red Dead Redemption 2 on the 4th tier balanced preset got an average of 37 frames per second and a 1% low of 24 frames per second. My opinion is that getting at least 30 frames per second in a single player game is acceptable, but if you're wanting to hit 60 FPS, you will definitely need to run this with much lower settings. Back 4 Blood on the medium preset got an average of 78 frames per second and a 1% low of 22 frames per second. The game ran smooth for the most part, but there were times the frame rate would drop hard. Resident Evil Village on the balanced preset and high 2GB textures achieved an average of 67 frames per second and a 1% low of 46 frames per second. Frames would sometimes drop into the mid-50s, but normally stayed in the 60s. Halo Infinite on the low preset got an average of 57 frames per second and a 1% low of 34 frames per second. Frame rate stayed mostly in the 50s, but would often drop into the 40s. New World on the high preset got an average of 53 frames per second and a 1% low of 38 frames per second. New World felt very playable at these frame rates, but lowering settings would bump it over that 60 frames per second threshold. Rainbow Six Siege on the high preset and ultra textures got an average of 113 frames per second and a 1% low of 67 frames per second. The frame rate also fluctuated a lot in this title. 1 second it would be in the 140s, the next dipping into the 70s. With Cinebench R20, the multi-core score average was 2042 and the average single-core score was 408. In Cinebench R23, the multi-core score average was 5291 and the average single-core score was 1051. The Blender Classroom benchmark using the CPU finished in 23 minutes and 43 seconds. And using the CUDA cores on the GPU, it finished in 8 minutes and 10 seconds. The Puget Bench standard benchmark for DaVinci Resolve got an overall score of 553. Opening the lid of this laptop is usually pretty easy and smooth, but on occasion I would have to use 2 hands, and I'm guessing it was just the angle I was trying to open it at. But if you're opening it from above, it's pretty easy. Total system power usage during idle was around 12 to 13 watts, 115 to 125 watts while running the Metro Exodus benchmark, and when running Cinebench R23 and Blender using the GPU, it pretty much fluctuated between 122 and 125 watts. I never really saw this computer go over that 25 watt threshold, which is interesting because the brick is supposed to be able to supply 150 watts. The exhaust fans weren't super loud, and I usually couldn't hear them while playing a game with the speakers at max volume. Speaking of speakers, this laptop has 2 speakers located on the sides towards the front. Here's how the speakers at max volume sounded while playing some games. And here, playing music. So this is what the webcam looks like and how it sounds. And I'm gonna go ahead and do some typing. Oops. So it definitely looks pretty bad, and I did listen to it a little bit and it sounds pretty bad. It's definitely picking up a lot of the background noise. I do have a few computers running in this room, so that is that whirring sound that you're hearing. But this is pretty bad. I mean, most webcams are. The keyboard feels great to type on. Here's what the keys sound like when I'm typing. The 120Hz screen has pretty decent color gamut coverage, which makes it excellent for content creation. The FX504GM weighs in at 5.2 pounds, or about 2.4 kilograms. Something I wanted to jump back to and mention about the special fans that Asus put in this laptop. On one side of each fan, there is a dust vent that is used to expel dust from the system. Not sure how effective it is with this laptop, but I do think it's pretty interesting. I rarely saw this gaming laptop go over 80 degrees Celsius, which is really nice, and the keyboard felt cool even after long gaming sessions. Overall, I think this laptop is still pretty decent even though it is a little bit older. The build quality is great, the keyboard feels wonderful to type on, and the screen is amazing. As far as gaming performance is concerned, playing AAA titles at native resolution with the settings low to medium usually gets you 60 frames per second. I can see this being a great option for someone who games but also wants to start doing some content creation on a budget. Even though I have found places where you can buy this laptop brand new for like, I don't know, $1,200 to $1,300, I would highly recommend going used, and I wouldn't buy this for more than $700 used. So what do you guys think of this laptop? Do you think it's still good for gaming with today's titles? Let me know down in the comments. Hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and hit the thumbs down if you didn't. Go ahead and hit subscribe as well if you're interested in more tech-related content from me, and also consider joining me on Patreon. And with that, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.